Hello everyone, welcome to Dave's English. My name is Dave, and in today's video we are going to be talking about if stress in a word is important or not, because a lot of my students do ask about this. And the answer to that is yes, not really sometimes, and it kind of is a little bit different based on the language and using your language in English, and it's kind of a little bit of a mess. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about whether stress is important and why maybe you should be focusing more on pronunciation when you're speaking instead of stress when we're talking about individual words. Before we start, if you're ever interested in taking any lessons with me one-on-one, please go to my website, Dave's English, or justsayitenglish.com, where you can sign up for one-on-one lessons with me, and I'll be more than happy to help with your English learning needs. So how important is stress? Well, it is important if you want to sound correct, but really stress is probably more for melodic reasons than it necessarily is for trying to understand English. So if I said a sentence like, how are you doing today? It would sound kind of weird. Instead of how are you doing today, the stress should be at the first part of doing. But you still knew what I was saying based on the fact that my pronunciation was very clear and you could understand the words. The stress just makes it sound right. So in English, a lot of times stress is just for melodic reasons. But in other languages, like let's say Russian, stress can be really important. Let me give you an example of a video where stress might be important.
Писать, to write, and писать, to be. As you can see, you don't want to make a mistake here.
Now, the reason why I use that example of Russian compared to English is because English is what we would call a non-phonetic alphabet compared to Russian, which is much more of a phonetic alphabet. And what do we mean by that? We mean that when you look at each individual letter in a word, we can maybe figure out how to pronounce it. And in Russian, for example, that's very much the case. We can look at the letters in the words and kind of spell it out based on the letters in most situations. But in English, it's a little bit different. So for example, this word here, am I saying live or am I saying live? You don't know, and the stress really doesn't matter because it's only one syllable. But the thing that has changed in this is we've changed the pronunciation. So if there's anything you get out of this video, I want you to really focus on the fact that pronunciation is king. And because English is a non-phonetic alphabet, you can have examples like Chicago, channel, and chemical, which all start with CH, but yet the CH sound is pronounced totally different. And it didn't matter where the stress was or anything like that. It's just that those set of letters in certain words, depending on what word it is, can be pronounced differently. So therefore, the stress really doesn't play a role in those words I just read off to you right now. So when is stress important? Well, it could be important if we don't necessarily have the context of something. So for example, we can say object or object. Now, an object is just a thing. We have an object, or part of a sentence, the object and the subject, okay? But if we say object as a verb, that means that you are objecting in a court or something like this. So object and object have the stress in two different places. However, one thing that you might notice is that we actually pronounce those words differently. So I say object and object, right? So you hear when I say object, we hear ah, right? But when I say object, yes, we have the stress there, but we say up. So the pronunciation actually does change. So if you just hear a word, if I just said, for example, object, without any context whatsoever, you can figure out that's the verb from where the stress is quickly, but the pronunciation should also help you with that as well. So again, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, pronunciation is king when it comes to English. So even though stress and pronunciation can change, this doesn't necessarily throw anything off. And just because there can be a stress change doesn't mean we might not understand it. So let's go ahead and talk about this in the context of American and British English. So in American English, we say the word weekend. We put the stress at the beginning, weekend. Okay, but in British English, they say weekend.
Figures out just at the weekend, showing that Wales had.
They'll put it at the end. They'll also use a different preposition. They'll say at the weekend, where we will say in American English on the weekend. So even though we use a different preposition, the word weekend has a different stress in the two different syllables in both American and British English. But we understand what's being said. Where the stress is located in that word doesn't really have an impact on anything at all. So, for example, the word reform. Now, in the northern part of the United States, a lot of people will say reform. However, if you go to the southern part of the United States, they might put the stress at the beginning and say reform. They even changed the pronunciation a little bit as well.
Just show you where this is in relationship to reform, all right?
So just because you see a word, there's not necessarily a 100% way to stress it or even to pronounce it. So understanding the context of the sentence is very important. Also understanding parts of speech, because where that word falls in a sentence can actually impact your understanding of that sentence. Now, I'm going to give you an example of stress not mattering at all, but we actually have two different words that are spelled exactly the same. So let me put the word up on the screen now. So how do you say this? Well, we can say it two ways, and one can be an adjective and one can be a verb. So we can say elaborate, and if we say elaborate with 3 syllables, it means it's big and fancy and really nice. We can say this room is really elaborate in the palace. So you can hear elaborate. Now, the stress is on lab, elaborate, right? But it's 3 syllables. If I want to make this the verb, I would say elaborate. Now, again, we have 4 syllables here, but the stress is still on lab, right? Elaborate, elaborate. The stress is on the same syllable. What changes? The pronunciation around that stress syllable. So this goes back to the point that I mentioned earlier. Pronunciation is king when we're talking about English. Not stress, but pronunciation. Also, another thing that we can do in a word is we can stress certain parts of it, especially if we have a prefix in a word, to really emphasize that certain thing. So I can say, for example, that he is unreliable. Now, I could also say he is unreliable. And what does that mean? That means I'm really stressing the un part, that he is not reliable. Now, if I just say he is unreliable, that's just basically saying it as it is, not really putting any stress. So in that situation, I would say he is unreliable. I might put on the I, unreliable. But if I say he is unreliable, by putting it there, it really stresses the un. So a dictionary might say that a certain stress is here. That's usually going to be where the stress is if we're just using it in a neutral way. But if we're really trying to focus on certain aspects of a word, there are certain parts of it with prefixes that we can stress more so that we can make more of what is being said. It's just kind of like with sentence structure, we can use do to emphasize a verb. We can say, I know him, but then you can also say, I do know him. And even in that sentence, we stress do. I do know him. So it just makes it a little bit stronger. We can do the same thing with prefixes as well. And then finally, and I mentioned this earlier, the whole idea of knowing what part of speech something is, because the word order can help you. So for example, if somebody said to me, I am going to record a video, now that's the incorrect pronunciation. We would say record, right? But if they say I'm going to record this video because they know the word record, I just happen to know that they mean record due to the fact of where that word is placed. I am going to, infinitive, to record, even though they say record. So it's very important to understand parts of speech in English, where words fall in a sentence and whatnot, because this will help you if somebody does mispronounce a word, whether it be a native English speaker, which we do all the time, or a non-native speaker, by knowing where that word is in a sentence, that's going to help you maybe understand what the person is saying. And they can even totally mess it up. So I just said record. Okay, so I could say record, which is the wrong pronunciation and the wrong stress. I could say, I am going to record a video. Even with that, I know you're trying to say, I'm going to record a video. This is where it maybe gets a little bit bad because you're doing wrong stress and pronunciation, but it could be figured out. And this is why it's important to have a teacher, for the teacher to tell you when in those situations where the stress should be and how you should say it. So that's another reason why you can maybe take lessons with me at davesenglish.com or justsayitenglish.com. All right, everyone. So I want to thank you all very much for joining me today. Just wanted to do this because a lot of my students, particularly from Slavic speaking countries, have this problem with stress. And honestly, they worry too much about where the stress is in a word. Pronunciation, pronunciation, pronunciation. So remember, that is the king. Yes, stress is important. It's actually quite important in sentences, which will be coming up in a future video. But in words, it's more to sound correct and sound right than it is necessarily to be understood. Again, I use that record example at the end to show that because we know the parts of speech and where certain parts of speech go in a sentence, we can figure out, we can glean from what you have given us as far as your sentence, we can glean what word you're trying to use. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are, and I'll see you in the future. Bye-bye.